Hello everyone, welcome to the Geekery in General podcast. I am your host, Al. Today, we are going to be discussing a topic that has been debated within the gaming community for a long time, but has gained noticeable attention over the last few years. And that is how some aspects of Dungeons & Dragons have been accused of being problematic, specifically in regards to racism and sexism. These are complex topics, and we will be touching on subjects that tend to stir up emotions. I want to assure you that I am making every effort to discuss these topics in good faith. I sought out views from both sides while I was preparing this episode, even when I could tell by the title of an article or a video that I was probably not going to agree with the content I was about to subject myself to. I learned a few things and exposed myself to some facts that challenged how I looked at the game that I have enjoyed for decades. There will be times when my personal bias will kick in, but my intent with this episode is not to vindicate one side and demonize the other. As a forewarning, this episode will touch on politics. I hate to say it, but tabletop role-playing games have entered the culture war whether we want it to be there or not. I also noticed while writing this script that the side one falls on regarding problematic aspects of D&D tends to fall along highly predictable political lines. I do not expect that I will deliver some profound nugget of wisdom to the D&D community that will unite everyone in peace and harmony. I'd like to think that I can get both sides to sit in a circle and sing campfire songs together, but I don't think my charisma score is high enough for that. I am adding my 2 cents to this debate because I think it is worth discussing. After looking into this topic, I think that both the side that enjoys attacking older versions of D&D and the side that defends old D&D both have faults that need to be addressed. Let me be crystal clear on one thing. I am not saying both sides are the same. Personally, I hate it when people use that argument. I see it as intellectually lazy, and it presupposes that both sides are essentially identical. I have my disagreements with both sides, but they are not the same. I have noticed that people who are harsh on old D&D tend to do so because of concerns related to negative stereotypes, cultural misrepresentation, inclusiveness, and equality. I might not agree with the manner in which they try to get their point across, but I can at least say they are expressing valid concerns, and most of them have their heart in the right place. I can't say the same for the other side. Their knee-jerk reaction is to call everything woke and then resort to dirty tricks like snarl words, ad hominem attacks, and logical fallacies. The intent I get from them is not a desire to engage in any sort of civil or intelligent discourse, but rather use it as an excuse to be a bully and call people names because that is what will get them views or likes for their social media accounts. To sum it up, one side has concerns on how members of certain groups are represented in role-playing games. The other will call you a woke, social justice warrior libratard for pointing out that some aspects of older versions of D&D are problematic. This bears repeating. Both sides are not the same. Based on my observations, I would say people who point out problematic aspects of D&D tend to be liberal or left-leaning, while those who defend older versions of D&D tend to be conservative or right-leaning. This does not mean such views are universally left or right. I'm sure there are liberal-leaning gamers who are unbothered by some of these controversies, and I'm sure there are conservatives who are genuinely concerned about offensive depictions. Now, I don't claim to have all the answers. All I ask is for you to hear me out and listen to the end. I am only offering up my opinions and observations on these matters. It is not my place to tell anyone what they should and should not find offensive. This is going to be a long one, so grab a drink and get comfortable. Let's begin. Where do the roots of problematic issues in D&D come from? Most critics will point to the depiction of orcs and how some races, most of which have dark skin, are represented as inherently evil. To understand, we need to look at some of the inspirations for Dungeons & Dragons. One of the inspirations is the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, though it doesn't have as much of an inspiration as you might think. Gary Gygax, one of the creators of D&D, has acknowledged that while he liked The Hobbit, he found The Lord of the Rings was too focused on being an allegory for the common country folk rising up against the Nazis. In the 1979 Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide, Gygax states that his primary influences included the works of Robert E. Howard, Fritz Leiber, Jack Vance, H.P. Lovecraft, L. Sprang de Camp, Fletcher Pratt, and Abraham Merritt. Let's start by taking a look at how J.R.R. Tolkien portrayed orcs. I want to stress that I am not an expert on Tolkien's work, so I will only be scratching the surface. Most of my knowledge of Tolkien's world comes from the Peter Jackson movies, so please forgive me if I don't get everything 100% correct. The earliest roots of the word orc are believed to come from the epic poem Beowulf. Thence all evil broods were born, Ettins and elves and Orkney. The giants also, for whom long fought with God, for which he gave them their reward. In this context, Orkney is translated to something along the lines of evil spirit or demon corpse. They were believed to be a corrupt race that descended from Cain. In one of his letters, Tolkien stated that his orcs were influenced by the 1872 story The Princess and the Goblin by George MacDonald. This story involves a young girl interacting with a group of goblins that lived in mines. Tolkien would go on to borrow the word Orkney and shortened it to orc. He had this to say in another one of his letters. Orc I derived from Anglo-Saxon, a word meaning demon, usually supposed to be derived from the Latin orcus, hell. But I doubt this, though the matter is too involved to set out here. Many D&D players will recognize Orcus as the demon prince of the undead. Before Orcus made his appearance in D&D, he was a Roman god. He was associated with the underworld, as well as being the one who punished those who broke their promises. He may have also been associated with a daemon named Orcos. In Greek mythology, daemons were lesser deities that were above humans but below the gods. Orcos was seen as the one who cursed those who violated their oaths. In Tolkien's world, the origin of orcs appears to be connected to Morgoth, the source of all evil. According to the TolkienGateway.net site, Tolkien never settled on a canon origin for the orc. The most commonly accepted origin is that orcs were elves or men who were tortured and corrupted by Morgoth. Tolkien was Catholic, and quite clear in his worldview that evil could not create, only corrupt. The following quote comes from Frodo in The Return of the King. "The shadow that bred them can only mock. It cannot make. Not real, new things of its own. I don't think it gave life to the orcs. It only ruined them and twisted them. And if they are to live at all, they have to live like other living creatures." Tolkien's orcs were sentient, capable of speech, and apparently capable of contemplating morality. This was a dilemma for Tolkien. He was very religious, and in one of his letters, he described The Lord of the Rings as, quote, "a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, rich in Christian symbolism." Should we see orcs as little more than mindless brutes that deserve to be slaughtered to the last? Or did they have souls, and were they worthy of redemption? This is one of the roots of the controversy. Should we, as gamers, see certain races as inherently evil, and thus only worthy of being put to death? Or is this an outdated concept that we should reject? The second controversy is the accusation that the way that Dungeons & Dragons and many other fantasy games have portrayed orcs is racist, and that they are supposed to represent real-world stereotypes. This may have its roots in how Tolkien described orcs. In one of his letters, Tolkien described orcs as follows: squat, broad, flat-nosed, sallowed skin with wide mouths and slant eyes. In fact, degraded and repulsive versions of the, to Europeans, least lovely mongrel types. Other accusations of racism come from his depiction of Easterlings and Southrons, both described as dark-skinned people. There have also been accusations that the dwarves of Middle-earth were based on negative Jewish stereotypes. Tim Shipley, a scholar on the works of Tolkien, had this to say on the manner in which he wrote. Quote, "The mention in the Battle of Pelennor Fields of black men like half-trolls certainly sounds racist. I think I would say here that Tolkien at this point is trying to write like a medieval chronicler, and when medieval Europeans first encountered sub-Saharan Africans, they were genuinely confused about them, rather than frightened." In a 2020 article on the Psychology Today website called "No, Orcs Aren't Racist" by Christopher J. Ferguson, had this to say about the matter. The second critique stems from the attempts to scour the writings of Tolkien himself for any evidence of racist inclinations. The notion that certain creatures are, by nature, evil or malicious permeates folklore in both West and East. Tolkien hardly invented the concept. But are orcs meant to be analogous for certain real-life races? The method of modern critical studies of media appears to be to scour the writings of an author for the worst possible thing they ever said and interpret this in the least generous way. Tolkien once wrote that orcs were degraded and repulsive versions of the, to Europeans, least lovely mongrel types. However, the qualifiers to Europeans and least lovely seem critical even in this supposedly damning description. Moreover, Tolkien historically wrote against and rejected racialist views, particularly as they emerged prior to World War II. There's an entire deep dive into the origin of orcs, who, at least in part, seem tied to humanity and elves rather than wholly separate from them. But the characterization of orcs as intentionally depicting the entirety of human cultures appears mistaken. Despite the quote above, Tolkien generally disavowed the notion that orcs were intended to portray an actual human culture. Some might even argue that the author's intent doesn't matter, death of the author, But there's an incoherence here. One can't argue from the author's letters to show intent, only to claim that intent doesn't matter when the larger evidence doesn't fit the narrative. Essentially, this question boils down to something of a Rorschach card. If you want to see racism in Tolkien's orcs, you will. If you don't, you won't. So how does this relate to Dungeons & Dragons? People who attack old D&D often claim that orcs represent stereotypes of black people. I read several forum posts and articles that parroted this talking point, often citing Tolkien and claiming that he was racist. I want to point out another quote from Christopher Ferguson on the Springer.com website from a 2024 article called "Do Visual Depictions of Monster Orcs Involve Racial Stereotypes?" Quote, "Most analysis rely on the author's own speculative assessment of the media's products in question, rather than a more cautious, pre-registered, empirical approach. In other words, it is the author's opinion that the content is racist, but this conclusion is not clearly documented in evidence. Related to this, traditions based in post-colonialism and other identity and power-focused theories may be incentivized to problematize media in ways consistent with their own narrative worldviews. In other words, post-colonial theorists may find problems in Western-based media simply because that is the raison d'etre of what such theoretical traditions do. Such traditions may beg the question wherein asking, is D&D racist? The only acceptable answer is yes. Over the years, much criticism has also been directed towards one of the game's creators. Yes, we need to address this elephant in the room. Gary Gygax said some offensive things during his life, as I'm sure we all have at one time or another. Refusing to acknowledge this fact is little more than sticking your head in a hole and downplaying something because it is inconvenient to your view of the man who created the game we love. I don't think we should go so far as to curse Gary Gygax's name for the rest of eternity, but we do need to come to grips with some of the things that he said and that he believed during his life. In a 1975 interview for Europa magazine, Gary was quoted as saying the following: "Damn right I am a sexist. It doesn't matter to me if women get paid as much as men, get jobs traditionally male, and shower in the men's locker room. They can jolly well stay away from wargaming in droves for all I care. I've seen many a good wargame and wargamer spoiled thanks to the fair sex. I'll detail if anyone wishes." I did try to find examples, though, of how Gary thought women ruined wargaming, but an online search turned up nothing. Another criticism of Gary comes from a post he made on an EN World Forum post on January 25th, 2004. As I have often said, I am a biological determinist, and there is no question that male and female brains are different. It is apparent to me that, by and large, females do not derive the same inner satisfaction from playing games as a hobby that males do. It isn't that females can't play games well, it is just that it isn't a compelling activity to them, as is the case for males. Both the Brainy Quote and AZ Quotes website have another quote from Gary, but they didn't specify where it came from or when he said it. Gaming in general is a male thing. It isn't that gaming is designed to include women. Everybody's who tried to design a game to interest a large female audience has failed. And I think that has to do with different thinking processes of men and women. I also came across a Facebook post on a Baldur's Gate 3 group from August 18th of 2024 that claimed Gary was an outspoken white supremacist and D&D was a realization of that worldview, though the poster didn't specify where they got this information and how they came about these conclusions. Accusations of racism against Gary come from his belief in biological determinism. According to the Wikipedia article on the subject, biological determinism is the belief that human behavior is directly controlled by an individual's genes or some component of their physiology, generally at the expense of the role of the environment, whether in embryonic development or in learning. This belief is controversial because it has its roots in scientific racism, which uses pseudoscience to justify slavery, racism, and the oppression of women. This should go without saying, but such a philosophy is unacceptable. On a Dragonfoot forum post on June 22, 2005, Gary made a comment that a lawful good character should have no problem killing a prisoner who surrendered if they belong to an evil race because nits make lice. This statement generated controversy because it came from Colonel John Shivington, one of the military leaders during the Sand Creek Massacre in November of 1864. During this battle, the U.S. Army attacked a peaceful Native American tribe. The number of victims of this massacre is unclear, but it was at least in the dozens and possibly even the hundreds. The victims included women, children, and infants. Here is what Shivington had to say about Native Americans. I'm going to forewarn you, this quote does use outdated terms. Damn any man who sympathizes with Indians. I have come to kill Indians and believe it is right and honorable to use any means under God's heaven to kill Indians. Kill and scalp all, big and little. Nits make lice. Gary's response didn't soothe over the situation. Quote, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth is by no means anything but lawful good. Prisoners guilty of murder or similar capital crimes can be executed without violating any precept of the alignment. He later added, Shivington might have been quoted as saying, nits make lice, but he is certainly not the first one to make such an observation, as it is an observable fact. If you have read the account of Wooden Leg, a warrior of the Shawnee tribe that fought against Custer at El, he dispassionately noted killing an enemy squaw for the same reason in question. Gary might be referring to a similar quote, nits will be lice. This phrase was used in the 1600s to justify why English Protestants should not feel guilty about killing Irish Catholic children. I have to be honest. I think Gary's response was horrible. First, the whole eye for an eye thing, which does date back to ancient times, was intended to be a standard for legal justice to prevent escalations and, more importantly, stress proportional punishments for crime. So rather than acknowledging that quoting a man who ordered the murder and mutilation of women, children, and infants was not the best way to go, he doubled down. This line of thinking, in which people are compared to insects, is harmful. Its purpose is to imply that certain people are little better than vermin and thus deserve to be exterminated. Does this mean that I think Gary was justifying the killing of certain people in real life solely on account of their race? No. I understand that he was speaking in the context of a fantasy world. But even with that in mind, quoting someone who you know is responsible for a real-life massacre that involved women and children is not a good look. In a November 22nd Facebook post from 2004, Heidi Gygax Garland had this to say about her father. Regarding the post by Ben Riggs, D&D co-creator, Gary Gygax was sexist, in my opinion, much seems to have been taken out of context and pieced together. I cannot verify the sources, although I truly believe they are incomplete or incorrect. I think Frank Metzner states his insights on this eloquently. As from my perspective, I do not believe my father was racist or misogynistic. Was he sexist? He was born in 1938 to a father born in the 1880s and a mother born in 1806. He was raised in a traditional Anglo-Saxon Protestant family with traditional biblical family values where the male was the head of the household. In my opinion, yes, this is sexist and doesn't hold up to our more enlightened standards today. Yet, he was a loving father and husband who valued all his children and his wife. All three of his daughters played D&D with him at some point, but I happen to be the only one who still plays. In short, he wasn't perfect, but he was far from all of the negative accusations that are resurfacing, and I'm extremely proud, as a strong, independent female, to have E. Gary Gygax as my father and my family legacy. While I was writing the script for this episode, I was unable to find anything showing that Gary came to publicly renounce his controversial views before his death in 2008. That disappointed me. I respect Gary as a game designer, and he deserves all credit due for his part in the development of role-playing games as going from a basement hobby to an industry. But what should modern gamers do in regards to some of the controversial things Gary Gygax said during his life? I will confess I don't have an answer for that question which will satisfy everyone. Should we ask all gamers to shrug our shoulders and say he was just a product of his time? We could, but I don't think that is the best approach to take. However, the product of his time argument provides a reason as to why Gary may have believed some of the things he did and puts it into historical context. And we should consider the time in which Gary Gygax grew up. Now, I apologize, I don't remember which article I read this in, as I read a lot of articles while preparing for the script, but Gary and some of the other original writers for D&D were inspired by pulp stories that were popular during the 50s. These stories sometimes involved white people exploring distant lands and encountering lost civilizations. This is a guess on my part, but I doubt these depictions of non-Western culture were always accurate or positive. People in this era would have had limited opportunities to see accurate representations of non-European people and cultures. That being said, we can't use the product of his time argument as an excuse to justify harmful ideology. Doing so promotes stagnation and comes off as accepting toxic ideas because that's just how it was back then. People can change over time. As Muhammad Ali put it, the man who views the world at 50, the same as he did at 20, has wasted 30 years of his life. Yes, Gary was born in an earlier age, but he would have witnessed the civil rights movement, and more importantly, would have been old enough to hopefully understand why people wanted to end racial discrimination and segregation. Perhaps the best approach we can take is to separate the art from the artist. Gary was human and made mistakes, as have we all. we can acknowledge that Gary said some things that are wrong by today's standards. We can still appreciate the fact that he did make a fun and influential game. You might not like Gary's books or his games. You might disagree with his viewpoints. But at the end of the day, Gary was a fantasy writer and a game designer. He wasn't a politician passing laws that had real and measurable effects on people's lives. Now that we've taken a look at some of the roots, let's move on to what people are calling problematic aspects of D&D. The three biggest problems critics bring up are racism, sexism, and negative stereotypes. I have seen accusations of a lack of racial diversity in early D&D products. Now, I do realize early D&D is a vague term, but for all intents and purposes, when I refer to early D&D, I'm usually going to be referring to pre-second edition. The accusation of a lack of diversity in early D&D is not a baseless claim. Almost all of the artwork in these products does depict characters that are white or of European descent. According to the Wikipedia article on D&D controversies, humans were, quote, coded as culturally white and depicted as racially so in illustrations and game manuals, end quote. This article cites this as coming from Race and Popular Fantasy Literature, Habits of Whiteness by Helen Young. I believe that this is not as strong of an argument as people want to think it is. Dungeons & Dragons sprang from wargaming, specifically rules for simulating medieval European combat. Most of the monsters from early D&D were drawn from Greek and Norse mythology, as well as European folklore. So yeah, it makes sense that most of the people depicted in early D&D would be white. But nowhere in any of these books does it say you have to make a white character. If you wanted to make a character based on a type of Chinese folk hero called the Yuxia, an Arabian explorer inspired by Sinbad the Sailor, or a West African singer and storyteller known as the griot, you could. This is speculation on my part, but I don't think Gygax and Arneson set out to make a game that would include cultures beyond the European setting. They wanted to make a game that drew inspiration from a specific set of cultures and a specific set of sources, and that's what they did. Another accusation of racism, and sexism for that matter, comes from the fact that humans in early D&D could select any class and advance to unlimited levels, while non-human races were more limited. In addition, humans were the only race that could have a maximum of 18 in any ability score. In most cases, though, the female of both human and non-human races had a lower strength score maximum than males did. I do agree that limiting a character's ability scores based on their race and gender is wrong and outdated. I understand that males, on average, are stronger than females, but I've always seen adventurers as being exceptional people. There is, in my opinion, no reason to limit a character's abilities based on gender. It is true that demi-human characters do have level caps in pre-3rd edition versions of D&D, but to say that this is proof of those versions of D&D being racist is a stretch. The main reason these limits were put in place was game balance. To quote Gary Gygax from Dragon Magazine, issue 29, 1979, the character races in the AD&D system were selected with care. They give a variety of approach, but any player selecting a non-human character does not have any real advantage. True, some of those racial types have short-term advantages to the players who choose them. But in the long run, these same characters are at an equal disadvantage when compared to human characters with the same number of experience points. Players must weigh advantages and disadvantages before carefully opting for character race, human or otherwise. Now, I do have an older friend who has been into D&D far longer than I have, and he was actually friends with Gary during his life. He mentioned that Gary's intent was that he visualized D&D taking place in a post-Third Age Middle-earth style world where demi-humans were in decline. He couldn't remember where he heard it, and I couldn't find anything to confirm this, so take it as scuttlebutt. However, this gentleman does have Encyclopedia Britannica levels of knowledge when it comes to Dungeons and Dragons, so I'm willing to trust what he said. Another criticism of Dungeons and Dragons has been how cultures that are not based around Europe have been handled. During the TSR years, we saw 3 new regions added to the popular Forgotten Realms setting: Karatur, Al-Qadim, and Mazaka. These settings were intended to represent a generic Asian-inspired setting, an Arabian setting, and a Mesoamerican setting, respectively. These settings were popular during their day, but contemporary critics have been far harsher by claiming they overgeneralized the cultures in question. Al-Qadim was acknowledged to have some aspects of Arabian culture correct, but was criticized for focusing too much on the Arabia pictured in Hollywood. Mazaka has been criticized for being, well, basically a retelling of the Spanish conquest of Central and South America, along with racial insensitivity. We'll get more into Karatur in a moment. There may be some merit to accusations of racial or cultural insensitivity, but I doubt these depictions were of malicious intent. While I'm sure the authors of these products did take time to research the cultures they were attempting to portray, we can't forget they were making a game. They needed to be careful about what they included and how they included it. As a game designer myself, I understand this. You need to think if something will enhance the game and make it more enjoyable, or if it would be better to leave it out. This can be tricky if you want to make a game that you claim is historically accurate. I'm going to give an example that might ruffle some feathers, but hear me out. Imagine a role-playing game that is based on the Old Testament and claims to be accurate to ancient Hebrew culture. Now first, the books of the Old Testament cover approximately 1,500 years and a wide variety of time periods and events. Imagine their reaction if this hypothetical game included slavery, animal sacrifice, men having children with their wives' slaves, and characters committing genocide. I have no doubt that people would accuse this game of being problematic and anti-Semitic. However, these things I just mentioned are all included in the Old Testament. Leviticus, chapter 25, verse 44. Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. Leviticus 23:18. And you shall present with the bread 7 lambs a year old without blemish, and 1 bull from the herd and 2 rams. They shall be a burnt offering to the Lord. Genesis chapter 16, verse 1-2. Now Sarah, Abraham's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abraham, The Lord has kept me from having children. Go, sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her. 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 3. Now go and attack the Amalekites and completely destroy everything they have. Do not spare them. Kill men and women, infants and nursing babies, oxen and sheep, camels and donkeys. In a situation like this, Would you rather have the game designer sanitize historical content or include uncomfortable truths for the sake of historical accuracy? I know the Oriental Adventures book from first edition gets a lot of heat. I have a copy of it, and while I haven't read it cover to cover, I have skimmed the material. One commentator that has been harsh on Oriental Adventures is Daniel Kwan. I have found a couple of articles with the following quote from him. Quote, Oriental Adventures, the original version of which was written by 3 white men, often depicted Asians as violent and savage, uncivilized, and in need of foreign saviors, and as objects of fetishization. I tried to find specific examples that I could look up in my copy of OA. I was genuinely curious as to what parts of the book made Asians seem like a barbaric people who needed foreign saviors, but was unable to find any quotes from Kwan directly. I did get a summary from Yahoo Scout, though. According to the summary, OA was treating diverse Asian cultures as monolithic, mystical, and exotic aesthetic designed for Western consumption. This is a valid point, though to play devil's advocate, Oriental Adventures was written back in the early 80s, and hiring sensitivity readers and cultural consultants wasn't a common practice in the RPG industry back then. I do think we need to keep in mind, though, that this book was not intended to represent real-world Asian cultures. As Gary Gygax put it in the book's introduction, quote, the purpose of Oriental Adventures is to bring a new facet to the overall game and to encourage cross-cultural adventuring. Additionally, David Zeb Cook added, Oriental Adventures is broad in its scope. It does not restrict itself to a single country or time period. Presented here is material drawn from Japan, China, Korea, Mongolia, Southeast Asia, and the Philippines. Kwan's criticism did get Wizards of the Coast to put a disclaimer on some older products. He has also argued that WotC should no longer offer books like Oriental Adventures because by continuing to sell it, they were profiting off racism. I don't remember which article I read it in. Like I said, I went through a lot of articles and forum posts while writing the script, but Kwan thought that some of TSR's earlier problematic content should be treated like museum pieces, along with apologies and addendums, so people can learn from them. Again, these are not his exact words. I am paraphrasing. Predictably, Kwan's statements and suggestions did not go over well with some members of the RPG community. He faced online bullying, including being called a book burner and various slurs. Let me state this in the strongest possible way. That kind of response is unacceptable, no matter how much you disagree with Kwan's views. I would expect better from the role-playing game community, especially those of us old enough to remember a time when admitting that you played D&D meant people would label you as a freak or an outcast. So while I might not necessarily agree with some of the things that Kwan said, I do not think he deserved being bullied and called a book burner. However, there is one criticism of the material in OA that I feel critics have gotten wrong, and that is the subject of comeliness. According to the article, How Dungeons & Dragons Appropriated the Orient by Aaron Trammell, take, for example, the new statistic that is offered, comeliness. At face value, comeliness seems like a simple modification to the game's core mechanics, which had already been taking into account charisma for the better part of 10 years. But unlike charisma, comeliness is meant to speak more directly to beauty. He later adds, comeliness becomes a game mechanic in Oriental adventures because the feminized Asian man is part of the Oriental imagery. Now, I'm not sure where he was getting this idea of feminized Asian men from. I don't recall feminized Asian men really being a thing in the American pop culture of the 80s and early 90s. To continue, one of the 6 core abilities for D&D has always been charisma. This statistic is a combination of the character's leadership, physical appearance, and persuasiveness. Comeliness took the physical attractiveness out of charisma and put it as its own ability score. First, comeliness was not introduced in Oriental adventures. It was first introduced in the pages of Dragon magazine in November of 1982. It was added to the D&D rules in 1985's Unearthed Arcana and was included in Oriental Adventures, which was released later that year. It was not a new thing specifically for OA. Now, I do understand there are people who have a fetish for both male and female Asians, though to say that including comeliness in OA is somehow problematic and related to that fetish, well, that does come off as projection to me, but, well, that's just my opinion. Another criticism was the introduction of an honor score. Honor is described as being a reflection of both the character and his family, as well as his perceived trustworthiness and dependability. Honor can be gained through heroic feats like slaying a powerful monster, or lost through performing acts deemed cowardly or dishonest. OA does acknowledge that there is a difference in how honor is perceived in both the East and West. High honor does not equate with good, and having low honor does not mean you are bad. The imposition of an honor system within the rules of Oriental Adventures makes it clear what has been invisible and taken for granted in Western campaign. Unlike Western characters, the social worth of Oriental characters is always suspect. Again, this does seem like projection to me. I am no expert on Asian cultures, but I'm pretty sure that honor was seen as important in Japan back then. Now, of course, how we choose to define honor is another matter that I'm not going to discuss here. Finally, Trammell criticizes non-weapon proficiencies, which were introduced in OA. AD&D First Edition introduced the concept of weapon proficiencies, which meant your character could only learn how to use a limited number of weapons. OA expanded this mechanic to include non-weapon skills like tracking, blacksmithing, and wilderness survival. Doesn't sound very problematic, but according to Trammell, quote, the invention of non-weapon proficiencies in Oriental adventures reflects Gygax's work as an Orientalist. Non-weapon proficiencies became a game mechanic in Dungeons & Dragons at the same time that comeliness becomes a way of understanding masculinity in the game, and honor becomes a way of understanding one's social value, because the work of Orientalism is to produce a reductionist understanding of all culture. He also claims non-weapon proficiencies participate symbolically in colonialism's modern legacy. They reduce the richness of non-Western cultures to a set of non-weapon proficiencies, which can be developed and exploited to further the Western war effort. Gee, and here I thought if my character selected the cooking non-weapon proficiency, it just meant he knew how to make dinner. Honestly, I have no idea where he thinks he was going with this. I can agree with Daniel Kwan's concern over stereotypes and lumping multiple cultures into a generic setting. But implying you can have your character learn how to sing, fish, or make beer means you're participating in colonialism. Finally, there's the issue of sexism. One of the early examples critics point to is an article from The Dragon, which is the predecessor of Dragon magazine. In Volume 1, Issue 3, 1976, called Notes on Women and Magic, this article, written by Len Lakofka, limits the strength of female characters to a maximum of 14 out of 18. Additionally, it replaces their charisma ability score with a new ability called Beauty, which ranges from 2 to 20. Now, it's not my place to speak on behalf of female gamers, but I can understand why some women might see this as disrespectful. In my opinion, to take away charisma and replace it with beauty, you're essentially saying that women can only rely on their looks and not their ability to persuade and reason with others. It also says something to male gamers as well, that being we should place more value on a woman's looks than her ability to communicate. But why is beauty important? Because women get the ability to charm and seduce, of course, and they have abilities to not only charm men, but monsters as well. Oh yes, and back in the early days of D&D, your character got a title based on their level. Female thieves could look forward to being called things like a wench, a hag, or a succubus. The article also had rules covering how female warriors would use certain heavy weapons at a penalty, unless they had close to maximum strength, and how they could become more fatigued when wearing heavy armor. But hey, ladies, you get a +1 to attack with daggers, so there's that. It is important to note, though, that while the dragon was an official TSR product, the material within was optional and not a part of the core D&D rules. Still, I do think material like this was disrespectful towards female gamers and has no place in the game. There has also been criticism directed towards the tendency for early D&D artwork to depict scantily clad women. Personally, I chalk this up to the prevalence of male gamers in the hobby at the time, as well as artists being inspired by the men who worked on pulp magazines and novels that were popular back in the day. So what should we do? Where do we go from here? In my opinion, I believe the RPG hobby is currently divided into 3 camps when it comes to how we should look back on older versions of D&D. In the middle, there is what I would call the silent majority. These are people who don't get into politics and deep dive interpretations. They don't want to be called racist because they killed an orc, or be called a woke libtard because they decided to play a gender-fluid character. They just want to hang out with their friends, play a game, and have fun. But on the opposite sides of the community, you have 2 very, very vocal factions. These are the ones who I believe are responsible for much of the schism in the current D&D community. On one side, we have people who tend to be highly critical of anything prior to 5th edition. These are people who are more likely to label things as racist, sexist, or problematic. My major criticism of this side is I think some of their commentators tend to analyze everything they see, hear, and read for racist, sexist, transphobic, homophobic, ableist, Eurocentric, and colonialist content without paying attention to what is actually being said. They also have a bad habit of not taking things in their proper historical context and jumping to the conclusion that most appeals to their ego or whatever agenda they want to push or whatever book they want to sell. I want to stress that there is nothing wrong with pointing out problematic content in a game, but I think this side does have a tendency to come off as holier than thou. And if you don't agree with them 100%, then, well, you're part of the problem. But perhaps my biggest issue with their approach of labeling everything as racist, sexist, or problematic is that it can have the same effect as the conservative tendency to label everything they don't like as woke. I discussed this term a while ago in an episode called Anti-Wokeness is Destroying the Gaming Community. In brief, woke is a term that comes from African American vernacular that means to stay aware of systematic racism. Now, as I stated in that episode, I believe that the conservative tendency to overuse the word woke to describe everything they don't like is not just redefined the term, but made it essentially meaningless. I think throwing around terms like racist or sexist has the potential to do the same thing. Here is what I mean, and I'm going to speak very frankly and honestly here. Politically, I am a liberal, but I don't call every conservative and right-leaning person I meet a Nazi because doing so reduces the impact that such an accusation should have. I am 50 years old at the time of this recording, and during the course of my life, I have interacted with conservatives who were terrible people. I'm not saying this because we disagreed on taxes, gun laws, or legitimate political issues. These were people who were hateful, openly racist, painfully hypocritical, proudly ignorant, or just flat-out horrible human beings. However, I still don't think that they deserve to be lumped in with the likes of Adolf Hitler. Let me state this very clear and very firmly. Racism, sexism, homophobia, bigotry, and other forms of discrimination are wrong and have no place in a fair and just society and no place in the tabletop gaming community. But if our approach on the left is to slap everything we don't like with a negative label, we're not going to be taken seriously. This is how you lose allies and potentially turn your cause against itself. There was a Reddit thread from 2022 I looked at while writing the script called Why Traditional D&D Races Are Racist and What to Do. The thread's author made many of the points you would expect someone of this position to make. One of the parts of his post went as follows. My view is that, although the ideas of fantasy races are rooted in problematic colonial myths about non-European people, fantasy races don't have to be racist. What is racist is coding non-humans as specific, real, non-white peoples, like the consistent Japanese-inspired armor in the hobgoblin art, or saying one race is better or worse than the others. The comments were largely what you would expect. There were accusations that the author was flat out wrong and reading into things too deeply. One user, though, responded with a very blunt statement. When you are so privileged that you look for imaginary problems in a tabletop RPG, it might be time for you to look at spending your time in another way. Maybe take a nice vacation, or to, and note this next section was all in caps, actually combat real racism in the real world. But the issue isn't just with liberal-leaning gamers who feel obligated to point out anything that could be deemed offensive. As I said before, I think this is a both sides issue. On the conservative-leaning side, you have people who act as apologists for older versions of D&D and those who were involved in its creation. And there's nothing wrong with defending older versions of D&D. Now, this group does tend to consist of older gamers who are white, have been gaming since the days of 2nd edition or earlier, and who tend to be more conservative in their leanings. Sadly, most of these guys are the kind of people who love to label everything they don't like as woke, rant about the perceived evils of progressivism, turn a blind eye when it is convenient to preserving their worldview, and refuse to acknowledge that times change. I've got a couple major issues with the side. First, they tend to respond to fair critiques with personal attacks and logical fallacies. If another commentator suggests that an aspect of a game is offensive or disrespectful to underrepresented gamers, they'll just say the other side is being woke and repeat the other talking points that everyone else on this side likes to use. Second, I don't think I have ever seen one of these guys try to understand why the subject in question was considered offensive. Honestly, some of these people tend to come off as little better than a schoolyard bully. Only these are usually men in their 40s or older. Occasionally, some of these conservative-leaning critics have worthwhile things to say, but when they do bring up a good talking point, it is buried under name-calling, profanities, and ad hominem attacks. This is a problem. If you are making a logical argument, but devote most of your video or article talking about how horrible the other side is, then you throw away any goodwill or respect you may have otherwise won. In some ways, these folk remind me of the character Archie Bunker from the 1970s sitcom All in the Family. Carroll O'Connor, the actor who portrayed Archie, had this to say about him. Archie's dilemma is coping with a world that is changing in front of him. He doesn't know what to do, except lose his temper, mouth his poisons, look elsewhere to fix the blame for his own discomfort. He isn't a totally evil man. He's shrewd. But he won't get to the root of his problem because the root of his problem is himself, and he doesn't know it. There is another example I'd like to bring up. There's a YouTuber I watch every now and then called Actual Jake. The content I've seen from him is very much liberal-leaning. He has done several reactions to videos by another YouTuber called Diversity and Dragons. Diversity and Dragons is your typical middle-aged, white conservative D&D YouTuber who complains about how everything is woke. He was reading an article and mentioned a game store that sought to make the hobby welcoming to women and new players. According to him, this was virtue signaling. This guy apparently doesn't realize that making your hobby welcoming to new people is kind of important, especially when your hobby has lots of toxic loudmouths in online spaces. Diversity and Dragons implied that the game store in the article is probably being run by sex pests, which is probably him implying that they are sexual predators. He also made several thinly veiled racist, sexist, homophobic, and ableist comments, mocked someone who admitted to having anxiety issues, complained about a D&D adventure that had a handicap-accessible dungeon, and called YouTubers he didn't like boring or stupid. No wonder some people accuse older white male gamers of being sexist and racist. Now look, there is a part of me that doesn't blame people for wanting to defend older versions of D&D. Old school role-playing games have a very devoted fan base, and people in general will defend things that they feel passionate about. The problem I see with the way the anti-woke crowd goes about defending older versions of D&D is that it often comes off as misguided at best, rage bait grifting at the worst. As a general rule of thumb, if someone has something to gain from making you angry, then I would advise taking what they say with a grain of salt, especially if their entire online persona is devoted to making money off of promoting fear, hate, and anger. To sum it up, we have one side with people who will label things as racist, and the other side who will counter by claiming that by calling something racist, it means you're the real racist. This constant back and forth of you're wrong, no, you're wrong, no, you're wrong, you're wrong is counterproductive and gets us nowhere. Both sides are starting to sound like a broken record at this point. The only solution I see to this division in the community is both sides need to try to understand where the other side is coming from. Then, maybe, we might reach a more civilized and productive discourse on the manner of problematic content in not just D&D, but role-playing games in general. First, let's look at the people who tend to be harshly critical of older D&D. They bring up the harm of racial stereotypes and negative depictions of certain groups of people. As I said before, I think this is a valid point to make. Underrepresented gamers have every right to voice their concerns on these matters. One of the articles I read while writing this script was on the Psychology Today website called "Do Fantasy Role-Playing Games Promote Racism?" If you are concerned about D&D making people racist in real life, then you can take comfort in the results of a cited study. According to the article, a recent study, Ferguson, 2022, aimed to shed some actual light on this issue by examining whether playing this game is associated with greater racism, and found it is not. Additionally, most people surveyed, whether D&D players or not, did not find the depiction of orcs in the game either offensive or racist. I was able to find more information on Christopher Ferguson's website on a PDF called Evil Orcs. I didn't go over the full article, but I wanted to bring this up since it is important to understand the demographics being surveyed. The current study sought to address these issues in a sample of 308 adults, 38.2% non-white, a subset of whom, 17%, were players of the role-playing game Dungeons & Dragons. Playing Dungeons & Dragons was not associated with greater ethnocentrism. Only 10.2% found a depiction of orc monsters as inherently evil to be offensive. However, when later asked a blunter question of whether the same depiction was racist, the number jumped to 34%, with women particularly inclined to endorse this position. This suggests asking people about racism may prime them to see racism in material they hadn't previously found to be offensive. Neither participant, race, nor history of playing D&D was associated with the perceptions of offensiveness or racism. In reality, you should probably be more concerned about people with high levels of aggression. According to the Psychology Today article, people higher in trait aggression were more likely to say the depiction was racist might be because aggressive people are more likely to endorse harsh judgments about whether something is socially unacceptable. Higher trait aggression was associated with higher ethnocentrism in the study, which might indicate that highly aggressive people are self-righteous hypocrites. I want to take a moment to specifically address any white conservatives who might be listening. Now, if you think that people who try to point out problematic elements of D&D are overreacting, I ask you to consider this. What if every depiction of conservatives you saw in media only focused on stereotypes and negative aspects of conservative ideology? Imagine a world where every white conservative is pictured as a violent, gullible, racist simpleton who treated everyone who wasn't a white Christian conservative with contempt, who worshipped cruelty, and saw everyone who was different than him as an enemy. In short, imagine white conservatives being pictured as the orcs and drow of pop culture. I'm sure there would be much weeping and gnashing of teeth on that side. However, I believe if people who are harsh on early D&D want people to listen to them, then they in turn must be willing to listen to people who are sticking up for the game they're bashing. I have seen people defend older versions of D&D purely based on preference for those game mechanics and style of play. That is fine. Nothing wrong with that. This should not be a controversial take. But one of the complaints I hear from older gamers is they feel like they are being pushed out of a hobby they have supported for decades. Now, I don't think this is the microphone drop they want to see it as, but let's take a moment to step into their minds and see the point they think they're probably trying to make. Imagine you discover a local rock band. You go from seeing them at small venues like bars and coffee houses until they work their way up to larger venues. 20 years later, they are world-famous rock stars, and you were with them every step of the way. You remember when they were just a bunch of guys struggling to pay rent and buy new guitar strings. Then some kid who only started listening to them a year ago sees you wearing a t-shirt from their first album and tells you that you should find another band to listen to because they aren't your band anymore. You'd probably feel a wee bit disrespected. Perhaps the best thing we can do is keep in mind that D&D is constantly evolving. Remember, it was written back in the 70s. At that time, role-playing games weren't even a thing. Actually, the original white box set referred to D&D as rules for fantastic medieval war games campaigns playable with paper and pencil and miniature figures. Whew, that's a mouthful. Gary Gygax, Dave Arneson, and everyone else who wrote the early versions of the game were venturing into unexplored territory. They created an entirely new industry in a very different world. We need to keep in mind that there were certain views back then that were considered normal. I'm not saying they were right, but they were socially acceptable. We've come a long way since then, and if D&D is around 25 years from now, who knows if players then will look back at the version we're playing in 2026 and wonder why we found certain things to be okay. If you made it this far in the episode, I sincerely want to thank you. I know this hasn't been a fun topic, but looking at the things we've discussed today are rarely enjoyable. In closing, I must confess the script for this episode was difficult to research and write, and I don't think I have come close to even covering all aspects of it. I didn't even go into the issues people have with drow, half-orcs, and half-elves. I have spent no small amount of time researching and writing this episode, and frankly, I'm exhausted. Some of the articles, forum posts, and videos I watched made valid points. Others came off as just wanting to call people names and complain about things. I understand the balancing act that WotC needs to pull off. Obviously, they want to attract new players, but they also don't want to alienate the game's original fan base. To WotC's credit, they have tried to incorporate people from different races and body types in their artwork. And there's nothing wrong with that as long as it's being done for the right reasons and not because they want to check diversity boxes. Underrepresented gamers are part of the gaming community and deserve representation as much as we old white middle-aged guys do. This approach has caused backlash from both sides. Some people think WotC has gone too far. Others think they have not gone far enough. Well, as the old saying goes, you can please some of the people some of the time, but can't please all the people all the time. Let's not forget that D&D is a fantasy game. You can do whatever you want with it. If you want to keep orcs as evil brutes who are beyond redemption, then that is what you can do. If you want to give orcs in your campaign setting the same potential for good or evil as everyone else, then you're welcome to do that as well. And that is the beauty of Dungeons & Dragons. You can use it to tell whatever kind of story you want. If you want to weave a complex tale with multifaceted characters who are motivated by more than just power and money, you can. If you prefer to make your campaign a straightforward story of good versus evil, well, you can do that too. Do you just want to go into a dungeon, hack down some monsters, and take their treasure? No one's stopping you from doing that either. Ultimately, The problems in the D&D community today might be related to the nature of the online space. The internet is an attention economy. And unfortunately, bad behavior tends to get rewarded by the algorithm. I have little doubt that a YouTuber who tries to take a measured, reasonable approach to these topics will get fewer views and less attention than one where a middle-aged white guy in sunglasses screams into a webcam about how the youngins are ruining D&D and making it woke. I can't say I have a solution to this mess, but we should do what we can to resolve it. We can respect differences of opinion, but we should call out differences of morals. Protect your mental health by avoiding people who bring you down and stick by the people who lift you up. And most importantly, fight fallacy with fact. Take the moral high ground. The view is better and it gives you advantage on your attack rolls. If you made it through this episode and made it this far, I sincerely thank you for listening. Have a wonderful day. You have been listening to a presentation of Point of Insanity Game Studio. Visit us on the web at www.poigamestudio.com. Follow me on most social media sites at POI Game Studio, and check out my music channel on YouTube at Al Seeger Music.